Today we're going to be doing something a little different from what I usually do by deviating from my usual obsession with first-person shooters to go with an RPG that I'm sure many are aware of by now. I'll start off by saying that I actually like Obsidian Entertainment as a game studio. I think the first game that I actually played from them was Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 Sith Lords on the original Xbox. It was a fun time, and I remember it feeling like it was still a solid entry from what BioWare gave us with the previous Knights of the Old Republic entry. In all things considered, Obsidian has released a lot of really strong titles in the past. Over the years, they've dropped games like the underrated Alpha Protocol, the exceptional Fallout New Vegas, and even the incredible South Park The Stick of Truth. I'll admit, I've not played everything from Obsidian, with the most recent game that I can think of playing from them being The Outer Worlds, which I've gone through more than a handful of times since the game's actual release. But when I look back on what I have played from Obsidian, I see them as being sort of like this mix between Bethesda Game Studios and BioWare. Kind of like they take elements from each studios in a way and create something of their own. I think that in a way, it's something that's made me appreciate their games over the years as well, since at the time of writing the script, I don't think that I've actually played a bad game from them. Maybe some of them have flaws, but I never really thought of them as being garbage or anything like that. With that being said, I remember the first time that I saw the trailer for Avowed. I thought it looked okay enough. I figured it was their take on Bethesda's Elder Scrolls series, which was kind of interesting. I mean, let's see what they could do. Maybe Obsidian could provide something to help that Elder Scrolls fix, since who knows when Elder Scrolls 6 was gonna drop, I figured at the time. I also have to admit, outside of announcement trailers, I tend to not overindulge myself into looking too much into a game because I have a tendency to wear myself down with hype culture. All things considered though, the more that I saw from Avowed through the time it was announced to the time it was released looked not fantastic. I mean, I remember people directly telling me that every aspect of the game looked like absolute trash, but that didn't really bug me too much. Wait till the game's released and we'll see how it is then, I thought to myself. I've seen plenty of games with trailers that looked horrid that came out and ended up being pretty fun times. I'll also admit that I have a soft spot for what would be considered B-tier games. Stuff like Risen 2 and even Greedfall are games that I have a fond appreciation of. They're not the best games, but even with their pretty average quality, they're still fun. So with that said, surely Avowed doesn't need to raise bars or anything to keep me entertained enough to make it through the game, right? And even though some of the recent controversies surrounding the game didn't necessarily help in giving it all that much public support, I was personally still willing to overlook these questionable details to get to the point right now where, at the time of writing the script, I'm actually downloading the game on Steam. I have to be real too, I wanted to get to this one sooner, but I was too distracted by being handed the keys to Dragon Age Veilguard and then the release of Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, which, man, what a good game. But anyways, let's focus on Avowed, shall we? Avowed would officially release on February 18th, 2025. As far as I could tell, the game's overall scores were pretty okay, and at the time of writing, the game has mostly positive reviews on Steam. The game would release with a physical, and I quote, physical copy that includes a code for a digital download of the game with the premium steelbook edition. But if you want to take the digital route, you have either the standard or the premium edition. Naturally, I went with the standard as the premium content seemed to just be for a 5-day early access, some bonus skins for your companions, and access to a digital art book and soundtrack. So if you want to pay $89.99 instead of $69.99 for content that probably isn't worth it, well, there you go. Oh, and that premium Steelbook edition, $94.99. But this thing also includes a map and a letter from the developer as well if you just can't get enough of the game. Or if you don't want to buy the game at all, it's currently on Game Pass as well, so that's something. But anyways, in the past I'd try to do an entire recap of a game, but for Avowed, I'll just go over bits of this one story for anyone who really cares. I'll start off by saying that I'm not overly familiar with the Pillars of Eternity universe, but if you are, congratulations, you already know more about Avowed than I did going into this one because it's the same game world. This is something that I've actually always appreciated. Games like Suikoden, for example, where everything is set in the same world with every sequel expanding the lore more and more. When it comes down to Avowed and Pillars of Eternity, however, there is a major difference between the two games in that Avowed is an action RPG and Pillars of Eternity is a top-down isometric CRPG. Kind of a major shift, but still interesting. interesting. So anyways, in Avowed, you play as an envoy who we're told was touched by the gods at birth. The player character ends up being sent to a place called the Living Lands by the Emperor of Adir to investigate a spiritual plague called the Dream Scourge. Over the course of the game, you travel through multiple areas, each with their own unique and distinctive features, with lots of quests, somewhat interesting characters, and companions with varying backgrounds, personalities, and abilities that make them at least feel different enough. Oh, and don't forget all the player choice. You ultimately have your own way of going about proceeding through the game, with many options for how you want things to play out. In my playthrough, I pretty much did my own thing, trying to save as many of the towns as possible while trying to eliminate the Dream Scourge, with this group called the Steel Garrote not taking too kindly to my efforts.
The time has come to take the garden.
Orphans will never... Ah!
Yesterday, this island suffered in the grip of its own madness. Today, the Living Lands unites under one flag. One people. One law. One true God.
What I at least can appreciate about Avowed is that it at least has some form of roleplay elements with a pretty in-depth character creator that I have to admit I sort of got too exhausted to bother with. More interestingly, however, you're also able to choose different backgrounds. Think something like Cyberpunk 2077, where you could choose something like Nomad or Corpo and get unique dialogue options throughout the game. It's essentially the same kind of deal with Avowed, though it does start to feel like your background dialogue ends up being the only choice that you end up hitting after a while. Still, it's cool to see an attempt at making your background feel like it has a point to it. What I also appreciate with Avowed is that you have the ability to see your character in a third-person view, both in the world and even during some cutscenes. I always find it to be strange when a game has a super in-depth character creator and then there's no option to switch between first and third-person viewpoints. This was especially an issue I had with The Outer Worlds, which I didn't exactly understand what the point of the game's character creator was outside of just some kind of personal role-playing attachment. It would have been okay if the game had allowed you to switch your point of view. As for Avowed, I didn't really use the third-person view too much, but I will say that this was honestly something that I at least had an appreciation for. With the RPG stuff aside, I think there are things that a lot of people will like about the game. And while I don't think that the story of Avowed is groundbreaking or really overly engrossing or anything like that, I think there's still positives. For starters, this game does fix an itch in the same way that games like Skyrim are able to, with an interesting enough game world that has a lot of stuff to explore. I think this is probably the main thing that I could praise with Avowed, and is really something that I found to be refreshing, at least for the bulk of the game. It's all too common to see games these days with massive open worlds that have maps that are absolutely filled to the brim with time-padding checkbox content. What do I mean by that? Well, look no further than games like Assassin's Creed. These games are loaded with OCD triggering content that's capable of driving normies to the brink of insanity. Sure, Avowed is still able to drive someone crazy after they start to notice shimmering sounds that are audible when you're nearby treasure. But if this kind of thing annoys you, don't you worry, because there's actually an option to turn it off. In my opinion, not having it on makes the game feel more interesting enough, though it is tempting to keep it activated just so you don't miss out on any upgrade materials and money. By now, you may have already seen videos comparing things from Oblivion or Skyrim to Avowed as well. Something that I've always appreciated about both Skyrim and Oblivion is that it's possible for every playthrough of the game to feel different, and it's possible to straight up miss out on a lot of things, even after putting in hundreds of hours into the game too. While I don't think that Avowed is anywhere close to being like that, there is at least a certain degree of interesting things that you could probably miss out on in the same way if a bounty or a quest doesn't take you there. I swear I spent hours running around jumping on random stuff, finding hidden loot and vistas that I probably could have easily missed had I just focused on the story. I'm a huge fan of this kind of thing, and it was really something that I deeply missed while playing The Outer Worlds, since the maps weren't anywhere near as big as I had hoped they would have been and didn't really have a lot of substance to them. Sure, you had a bunch of different areas, but it felt entirely possible to see almost everything without ever needing to replay the game. That being said, Avowed does a lot of little things that makes the game world feel like it's worth exploring. While in the Scatterscarp area, and really just running around aimlessly for fun, I stumbled across a small village with houses that were burned to the ground. It definitely piqued my interest enough to see what was going on, eventually eventually running to this well where I heard a growl. Naturally, I wanted to see what was down there. It took a bit of snooping around, but I ended up finding a key to unlock it and went down, discovering that there were people who had locked up the infected dream thrall. This is the kind of stuff that I can appreciate in an open world game. That sense of discovery when you just kind of come across something interesting that's possible to miss. All things considered, I do think that there are things that could have been done better in Avowed for sure. The fact that you could just grab stuff off of tables and rob people's homes with minimal reaction is strange, since even the Outer Worlds punished you for stealing.
Hey, what do you think you're doing?
You do get interesting reactions for doing stuff. Sometimes. For example, while in Paradise, I blew up a wall that caused the nearby dude to yell at me.
The ruins! Why assault our ancient Pargrunan ruins? They could have just walked around that wall. Someone help! The god likes a maniac!
I thought this was kind of funny because it made me think something was gonna happen. It honestly made me a little paranoid for a second until I realized that no guards were coming to arrest or punish me for the damage that I caused. It's fun to hear a reaction, but nothing really comes of it. It's not all lame though. The game does have some things that I found to be fascinating. I like that if you shoot an electric imbued weapon at water, you'll see lightning shock effects, or if you use ice related weaponry on water, it'll freeze, allowing you to solve puzzles that might require you to walk on the ice. This isn't anything new, since we've been able to do things like shock water in games like BioShock and create ice platforms that we could use to cross water and stuff like Breath of the Wild. It's not anything groundbreaking, but it's cool to see. But even with things that I found to be neat little touches, there's a lot of weird things to the game that feel archaic. And going back to those comparison videos, I completely understand how lame it is that you could smack stuff on tables and not see anything move. I think there's a level of basic expectations that you can have when you see other games doing something cool and then others missing on immersive features outright. This was honestly something that I remembered as a kid playing Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PlayStation 2. That tanker section of the game, shooting bottles and watching them break, was like the greatest thing ever to me. It was like, man, this is the future. It sounds stupid, but I think expectations on certain aspects of games kind of ruin releases that came after for me in a way. So many games have objects that you could smack at and realize they're just indestructible set dressing. Now, you can in fact actually break some stuff in Avowed, like these boxes which you can actually just run into to break. But when it comes to things on top of tables and whatnot, it ain't going anywhere. Well, mostly. I did find a table or two where you could walk on them and move stuff around, but it was all basically indestructible. Would it have been nice to be able to walk on a table and just smash everything to pieces? Well, sure, but I'll be honest, I just want a game that runs good and has minimal bugs. Oh, wait. Yeah, the game isn't exactly perfect by any means. Not just that, it kind of runs not too hot either. For me personally, without frame generation turned on, the game felt laggy, especially in towns where there's a ton of people. This is always something that'll be dependent on someone's system, but for me, it seemed kind of rough. And to make things worse, Avowed is a mixed bag on the graphics department, which makes you question the performance. I mean, get a load of this abomination.
Trust me, I'm used to getting looked at. For good reasons. And bad.
When I first saw this thing, I was stunned at how ugly it was. And can you believe that she becomes a party member eventually too? It's not all bad to look at though. The game does provide a lot of moments with incredibly scenic views. In the first real zone of the game, Dawn Shore, I actually climbed to the top of a lighthouse and was actually kind of amazed at how good the game world looked. It was quite nice and really made me appreciate how vast the world in Avowed felt. With that in mind, some of the zones in Avowed feel huge. When I got to the game's second zone, Emerald Stair, I felt like I had a whole new world brought to me with lots of stuff for me to explore. In a way, it was almost overwhelming compared to the first zone. The thing is, the scope of Avowed feels massive at first glance. Is it like Skyrim in the sense that if you see something, you can probably go and climb it? Well... Not exactly, but there is still a lot of great stuff that you can find in the game if you give it a chance. I don't want it to seem like I'm bashing Avowed entirely or really at all. I did have fun playing through most of the game, mainly thanks to things like the combat. I think starting off I was a little iffy. I wasn't feeling the starter sword that you got. However, everything changed once I picked up a gun. Call me crazy, but my enjoyment factor with Avowed shot up the moment I realized how fun it was to shoot stuff. I went from feeling like, man, I think I want a refund to, man, I want to blast something. Unfortunately, this enjoyment did start to fade out towards the end of the game. Battles that initially felt chaotic and tense with loads of things to kill started to feel annoying after a while. Seriously, after like 10 hours of the game, the groups of enemies start to feel exhausting. I just think that the game lacks that extra pizzazz to keep things fresh when every encounter blends in to the point of being almost identical to the last. I don't know if I can only blame the monotony of just smacking at stuff and using skills repeatedly, because I don't think that's the only issue. You think that having different skill trees and stuff with loads of abilities to unlock would help make fighting feel more interesting, but that's not really the case. While it's cool to be able to unlock new abilities and whatnot, there were so many instances where I found myself to be mildly disappointed. At one point, I unlocked a bear initially thinking that was going to be the greatest thing in the world, but after I used it a couple of times, I was just like, wow, why does this feel like it sucks? But on the flip side, even if you make mistakes building your character, you do have a respec option, so that's helpful. I guess I'd also say that even though I found the bulk of the abilities to feel lackluster, I don't think they're the only issue that I had with the game's combat. I think I'd also blame the visuals too. There was a point where I did start to wish the game was similar to how Bloody Fallout was, where we could witness body parts and things explode to help make dropping stuff feel more engaging. Not to say you don't have any interesting visual effects, because you do. Enemies will disintegrate into dust if hit with lightning effects or shatter if they're frozen. However, I felt like I just wanted to see some gore, you know? I think in that regards, this is a very tame game. There's a lot of mature drama for sure, with elements of the Steel Garot's brutality and all of the politics in the game with some harsh choices that come up throughout the story. But man, it's very PG compared to something like Skyrim, where you could literally decapitate someone. It sounds weird to say, but you don't realize how much you miss this kind of thing until you don't see it anymore. I mean, hell, even recent stuff like Bethesda's Starfield is super toned down compared to their previous games. But with Avowed, it feels like the game would have been ripe for more violence, especially since you get these things like this stun meter attack, where it looks like you're about to unleash a super brutal attack, only to see the enemy just kind of get smacked. It looks cool and everything, but man, I think it would have been better with some limbs being severed or something. I think that most of my thoughts about Avowed lean towards this feeling that the game could have and should have been so much more. Mid is the first word that comes to mind when describing the game. I mean, hell, I don't even think that I'd recommend anyone buying the game unless it's heavily discounted. That being said, for the game's first few areas, I can honestly say that I really enjoyed everything the game offered. However, this really faded out by the time that I reached the Galawain's Tusks volcano area. I don't know what it was, but by this point, I was just ready to be done with the game. Up until then, I had been doing all the side quests and just blasting away at everything that crossed my path. Things like the combat weren't enough to make up for the not so fantastic story, and a lot of the side quests had started to wear me down due to tedium. I couldn't bring myself to build another totem or help another bystander, and really the last few hours of the game, I found myself sprinting by everything since I had been completely upgraded and had no reason to do anything else but get to the end of the game so that I could finish writing the script. Don't take any of this like me hating on the game or anything. I just got a little tired of Avowed towards the end. I think what I played was a fine experience, but maybe certain aspects could have been better. I mentioned that enemy encounters started to feel repetitive after a while, but that wasn't the only issue. Stuff like side quests and whatnot I just got tired of, and that sense of discovery that I appreciated for the game's 15 to 20 hours quickly dissipated, and what was left was me just feeling sluggish. Avowed took me around 25 hours, and I swear the last 5 was spent bolting through areas, only killing what needed to be killed in order to progress. Does that make Avowed bad? Well, no, but I think that things like having to search gigantic circular zones for items to complete side quests really started to burn me out. I always feel let down when a game starts to feel like you need to look up guides to complete side quests that should be no-brainers. It becomes tiresome after a while, like you're doing some garbage detective work. I have no issues with things being vague or hidden for optional areas and whatnot, but for side quests, it's just like, bruh, just not worth it after a while. So what else is there to say about Avowed? Not really much. The game is just okay, not really worth spending too much time with since there's so many other fun games out there, but that doesn't mean that'll always be the case. I mean, the game's gonna be on sale eventually. Avowed is a good game that serves as an okay time waster. All things considered, I think there are things that someone can find enjoyment with in the game itself, but I just can't really recommend it. You know, it's funny. Avowed has gotten a lot of hate, some of it warranted and some unwarranted. It's crazy that whenever a mediocre game comes out, gamers get called toxic and entitled for voicing their issues with a product. I feel like that's far from the truth. If anything, I'd say that gamers are too nice. Gamers are the ones who will continue to support studios even after they've been stabbed in the back with terrible game releases that are extremely broken and buggy or just downright bad. Even Obsidian is guilty of this too. I mean, you could go back to over a decade ago with people talking about how buggy their games are. I don't think this kind of thing necessarily matters all that much since people will still play through something and endure the bugs if a game is fun. And people will still buy a game if it looks cool or entertaining enough. I mean, I'd still probably buy the next Elder Scrolls game even after boring myself to tears with Starfield. And I'll probably still end up playing The Outer Worlds 2 even after being let down by Avowed. It's just whatever. At the end of the day, not all games are going to be for everyone, and not all of them are going to be hits, nor will they all be misses either. Avowed has positives and negatives. I guess it just depends on how you look at it. Either way, game's just not worth the price with so many other better games out there, and that's all there really is to it. Thank you all for watching. Bit of a mixed bag with Avowed for me, but I'm curious what y'all thought, so feel free to comment below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. We'll be back with more soon enough, so stay tuned. Until next time, peace out.